Hi there, I'm Tris. I'm a front-end developer at ClearLeft, where we help design leaders get the most from their products and teams through work as an agency and through our events. I'm going to talk today about how we went from a blank sheet of paper to a multi-site headless CMS and a hyper-performant, accessible site in just a number of days. I'll also touch on how developers can communicate better with stakeholders and the content team, and use a web project as an agent for change in an organisation. Like all good stories, ours starts with a meeting. Thanks to COVID, our portfolio of physical events had to be postponed. But like with this conference, an opportunity arose. ClearLeft decided to organise our first virtual conference, SofaConf, an ambitious 5-day online affordable event covering topics such as service design, product strategy and research. We had about 8 weeks to bring it all together. It was 9 AM and we gathered online to kick off the project. With no more than a name, we began discussing what we'd need to pull it off. Firstly, we'd need a website. Event websites are a bit of a speciality for us. Having organised events for the past 15 years, we've built more than our fair share of them. But lately, most new sites have been created as annual additions on top of established platforms, the 2019, the 2020 edition. This project, however, was different. It was a totally new prospect with no foundations or starting points or leg ups, or no baggage or constraints, depending on how you look at it. See, it's rare to have a project where all bets are off and you have total freedom. When they come along, grab them. Developers tend to be known as the no brigade, the ones that come to a meeting and pour cold water on the ideas of others, saying it's too complicated or it will take too long. Come at a project meeting with an attitude of experimentation, enthusiasm and excitement. Listen out for those moments where you, as a developer, can add real value. The big issue we had for SofaConf was time. It was one of those, if we could launch this like yesterday, that would be great sort of meetings. We discussed just building a hard-coded site in classic HTML just to get it out the door quickly, and then retrofitting a CMS later on. And that is a decent option if you're really strapped for time. But strangely, I find it's often easier to get time for a new build than it is to get time to pay back technical debt. Once something's launched, unless it's causing major problems, it tends to just get forgotten about. Now, our standard stack for an event site is Craft CMS, a PHP server-rendered content management system, but it has big downsides. With the CMS and front end tightly coupled together, we end up blocking the content team until we've done our job building the whole site, which often leads to a frantic few days for them just before launch. We had a long-term plan to create a centralized headless CMS that would speed up development and remove this blocker for our colleagues, but finding time for it in the company just wasn't really a priority. As I said, unless it's broken, things tend to just get left alone. But as a front-end development team, we didn't abandon that plan. We had a vision for this project, and when the opportunity arose, we took it. Why? Because making the lives of your colleagues easier is a massive and often overlooked incentive. We work on a global web where we have no real idea if we're hitting the mark with the things that we create. How cool is it that we can remove the pain points from our peers with an immediate feedback loop? And we're primarily a front-end development team at ClearLeft, so why would we care about building a headless CMS to begin with? Well, as counterintuitive as working on a back-end project was, in the long term, building a more complex CMS once freed us front-enders up to work on the things we actually love doing. So despite the slightly ridiculous timeframes and the sheer amount of work building SofaConf and this generic event system was going to take, this opportunity was just too good to miss. But which stack to choose? Tech stack choice impacts the business. You need to be confident that a decision isn't being based on the shiny, but on objective truths that make sense for your organisation. Changing everything can be a huge risk to a business. And you might be in that situation where suggesting a wholesale shift to a new stack is going to be met with stubborn retorts. I know that feeling. I spent 6 years in a WordPress-only design studio. we were comfortable and pretty effective at building bespoke WordPress themes, but it meant we were totally blinded to other better options. And along with other obvious wins like increased performance, less downtime, cheaper hosting, changing a stack also has the ability to unite a team. Change is your secret fuel. People want to be part of change. Teams gather around ideas that will change things. As a developer taking time out to attend this conference, I have no doubt that you want to try the latest and the greatest technologies and hopefully use them responsibly. So I have some tips for bringing the rest of the organisation along with you. Number one, try out the tech first. Side projects or internal projects are a brilliant place to try out new tech before putting it into production with a paying client or your own company. Use them as a way of dipping your toe into the water, seeing what works, and more importantly, what doesn't. Side projects give you confidence to step up and put forward a bolder solution when it matters. Number two, prototype. Jumping straight into a new build is risky, so use prototypes as a way of breaking down the problem before you have to commit to it. Write throwaway code that answers any of those gut check fears you might have. It doesn't have to be a full end-to-end solution either, just enough to get you to a point of being confident that you can deliver on the whole thing. Number three, do your research. Unfortunately, gathering requirements for the web is a whole separate talk, but I've written a blog post on the subject should you wish to find out more. To summarise, I start by gathering the whole team, designers, stakeholders, marketers, developers, and we work out our non-functional requirements, i.e. how the system should work, and then our functional requirements, what the system should do. Then I'll gather a long list of stack options, and then mark them up with a weighted ranking to ensure that all our requirements are going to be met. Now break down those top results from the ranking further with pros and cons. Discuss the risks as much as the benefits. And this should all feed into the beginning of a conversation with the rest of the team. And number four, change one thing at a time. The scientific method of control pays dividends if you've got wary stakeholders. Changing one thing minimises risk and can hold the key to unlocking the go-ahead on a project. That doesn't necessarily mean only changing one thing, but changing one thing that affects your stakeholders. Take a new CMS, for example. Making the jump from one platform to another is a big step. Not only is there a mass migration of content, a full rebuild, new infrastructure, there's now a whole bunch of training that has to happen to get the rest of the company up to speed with the new system. For SofaConf, we could have either chosen a cloud CMS designed to be consumed in a headless way, or kept the CMS the same as it is currently, and then added a headless endpoint. The first changes everything, the second exercises control. Now these tips are all a way of increasing your confidence with a platform before you pitch it to others. This isn't so you can go into a meeting and brashly lay out your master plan, but to give you, the doubting developer, the quiet confidence that your solution has solid foundations and is worth considering. The net result for SofaConf? We went for Craft CMS as our headless platform. It's familiar to the team, so there was no retraining required, and it fulfilled all the headless requirements that we set out before profiling all the options. Now, when we picked the front-end stack for SofaConf, the principle of least power guided our thoughts. Choose the least powerful language suitable for a given purpose. Solid, accessible HTML should be the base of any web stack, and if everything fails, and at some points it will, your users will still get the core content. And with that in mind, a single page application was off the table, and it left us with three routes. Number one, a traditional server render. Two, a modern server-side render. And three, a Jamstack approach. Server rendering means managing a live web server which requires time, skills and resources. And as nice as Next and Nuxt.js are to develop in, they can be quite expensive and a bit of a pain to host still. But more importantly, a live web server also means a live API, which is another point of failure, and Jamstack removes that. Jamstack is an approach or a methodology for building websites where you aim to pre-render as much of the site up front and serve it via a content delivery network or CDN. This removes the need to manage web servers that render on the fly, allowing you to scale quicker and at a lower cost while delivering an accessible, content-first experience. The name JAMstack comes from these three pillars. The J, JavaScript, meaning the client-side code that enhances the experience. The A for APIs, meaning the distributed business logic for complex interactions. And the M for markup, meaning the pre-rendered HTML that gets sent down the wire from the CDN. Now, two of those parts aren't mandatory. The only important factor is to serve HTML through a CDN. It means a WordPress site, a Node.js site, or a single-page application are not JAMstack-driven. But as well as that original definition of JAMstack, I think there's another way to frame it. The J for JavaScript, meaning developers, you and I. The A for APIs, meaning the business logic, the business interests, the stakeholders. And the M for markup, meaning the content team. Three parts of the web process, all connected together through a single stack. See, by design, I think JAMstack provides an opportunity to bring the team together more closely than on a traditional build. And I think a JAMstack approach helps you think more systematically. A web page is fed by multiple data streams. In a traditional CMS, you'll make a database query for the header, and then the content, the related content, the footer, and each query there comes with an inevitable performance hit. It's generally minor, but they do mount up, and some queries can be quite expensive. So to minimize impact, we tend to use monoliths with centralized data. Connecting to one database is costly enough, so why would you connect to multiple? But in a JAMstack-driven site, we don't have those limitations in the same way because we're pre-rendering. Content can be fed from several places: markdown files, image repositories, API calls, GraphQL queries. This means we can store content in its rightful place. And those heavy database queries I mentioned earlier, it's not a problem for JAMstack, as the fetching happens at build time, not at run time. You can scale down those big API and content servers that currently have to serve every single request, and go for a cheap server that only gets hit when the site is rebuilt. And if you need to convince your financial stakeholders, this can be a powerful motivator. But as a user-centered developer, the key differentiator of JAMstack over other methodologies is the user over developer attitude. With JAMstack, we take on the performance hit so our users don't have to. That longer build time that it has isn't there for a mistake, it's there for a reason. If it's minutes for us, but we're saving seconds for thousands of our customers, I think it's a price worth paying. I think it makes economic sense, but it's also the right thing to do. And in the monolith world, there's a bit of a glass ceiling for creating a high-performing website. Surprise, surprise, time and money tend to be the limiting factors. And if you're a freelancer or working in a small agency, shared hosting is often all that's attainable and affordable. But JAMstack puts global performance into the hands of the masses. It's in reach for all those developers like I was who don't have vast budgets or time for performance optimization when you've just got to ship that next website. Now, back to the story. Writing technical specifications seems like a job for a developer, right? Well, kinda. Sure, deciding database entities and components might be a technical job, but it's also a great opportunity to bring in the experience of the rest of your team for a better result. This was one of the personal highlights of this project for me. I spent a couple of hours mapping out the system with my colleague Sophia, the events coordinator who would ultimately be the one who was using the system. With her wealth of events knowledge and my ruthless determinism to make things as generic as possible, we landed on a list of models and fields. She was able to share what caused her pain with the previous CMSs that had been built for her, and I was able to put forward fixes. Without her input, I'd no doubt have created a bunch of future headaches for her, and what a joy to be able to alleviate those at the start of a project. We designed the CMS there and then, and were able to share the entities and the endpoints with the designer to let them know what data they had to play with. Now, once planning was complete, my first goal was to deploy the CMS as soon as possible. We all know that good web development takes some time, and there can be an unfortunate but not always unfounded attitude in our companies that developers always deliver late. So my aim is to get the spotlight off me reasonably early. The sooner I can deploy the content editing experience, the better, but only if it works. The worst thing I can do is deliver something that's faulty or needs patching. So I've also found that developers enjoy that big reveal moment where we show off our finished creation to the rest of the company, and we get that huge rush of dopamine when all those wows come in. But really under the surface, I think it kids us to feel like we're more in control of the deadline than on a more iterative project, like we hold all the cards until the very end of the project. But it always tends to be followed by a list of bugs or snagging items, souring the end of the project as we then rush to get it over the line. Aiming for an anticlimactic go-live is actually a really sensible approach. Nothing went wrong doesn't sound all that exciting, but it makes business sense and it's far less stressful for you as a developer. And with a deploy early mindset, you can adapt your code and design as the content arrives by pointing your local dev environment to the staging content area. Rather than baking that content API endpoint into the application directly, expose it as an environment variable so it can be injected externally. .m files or package.json scripts are great for this, and a good example of an approach I call just scalable enough. We can get fixated on scalability in our projects, particularly when we see conference talks about how the big tech companies do X or Y. It leads us to totally over-engineer our own code. Plan for appropriate scale, optimizing the things that will actually cause you pain in the future. Now, taking into consideration our earlier research, concluding that a JAMstack approach was going to be right, and taking into consideration the clear-left front-end team skill, Hugo, Eleventy and Gatsby all look like good contenders. Unfortunately, Hugo, as nice as it is, can't ingest an API to create pages on the back of it. And Gatsby ships with just too much JavaScript unnecessary for rendering a content-driven website like this. And that point about creating pages from an API is the key differentiator of Eleventy from a lot of static site generators. As well as ingesting Markdown really well, Eleventy allows you to pull in API data sources and then render pages off the back of them. So let's go through how we'd do that, how we'd create a set of speaker pages for the conference. This was one of those tech spikes that we carried out early on. We have an API endpoint in Craft that returns all the speakers like so, an array of speaker objects holding their basic information. And we can achieve this with the element API in Craft, which allows us to return JSON rather than HTML. Here, we set out our endpoint, we query the person post type, we filter down to only return speakers, and then we return their basic information. Note that we decided to have people that can be speakers rather than just speakers. Events also have MCs and workshop organisers that need to be on the website too. Had I not had that planning session earlier with my colleague, that wouldn't have been accounted for. And now for the front end. Eleventy allows us to put content fetching scripts in the underscore data folder, and it will call them every time it rebuilds the website. Each script uses a utility function that wraps around the package node fetch and allows us to bake in some sensible defaults for the API calls we're going to make, as well as expose those important parts for overwriting with environment variables. See those lines setting out our API variable? Those are where we first ask if there's an environment variable called API, and if not, we fall back to the sensible default. This means we can run against our local API without any environment file. We can then create a .m file, setting the variable API to point to the staging API. And finally, for the live server, we can inject an environment variable at build time to point at the live API. So through this, we've avoided putting secrets into our repository, but we've also opened up the possibility for testing more thoroughly, and this is what I call appropriate scaling. Now we can call our utility function, we can pass in the endpoint and return the data back to Eleventy. And this is an asynchronous function, so use it as a place to call multiple endpoints, prepare your data before it arrives in your view layer. And this is server-side JavaScript, so you can pull in all those heavy Lodash or moment libraries you want here. It's not going to impact the user at all because it all happens at build time. Finally, Eleventy exposes this response as a global variable called speakers, and using the -pages.nunjuck format, Eleventy will loop through all the array of speakers and then create a page for each one. Now, onto deploying the sites. We already have a LAMP deployment set up at ClearLeft, so putting Craft on there made the most sense. But this was a global virtual conference, so a global hosting solution for the front end was preferred, and Netlify was the natural choice. Netlify runs the build command npx 11t, rendering the sites and pulling in the latest content every time we push to the main branch in GitHub. And there lies a little problem. The site only deploys when new code is added, not new content. How do we trigger a build when content is written? Also, with a traditional CMS, when you hit publish, the changes go live immediately. And with a Jamstack site, there's that short build time delay. Now we know that's to boost performance for the user, but how do you sell that to your colleagues who just want things to go live quickly? Well, that traditional go live as soon as you hit publish thing can be flipped around to be seen as much as a bug as it is a feature. Conferences often go hand in hand with big announcements. Here are the speakers, here's the schedule for the week. And sometimes you want to stage a number of changes and then deploy them in one go. And that is something that Jamstack can help with. And it provides a great way to explain away that go live delay. So we need a way of letting content editors trigger a build when they're ready to do so. And Netlify has this nifty feature called build hooks. And they let you run a build whenever you send a post request to a unique URL that they give you. So one option to hook this up would be to create a small web page on a private URL. You can put a big red launch button on it, and every time the button is pushed, it sends a post request off to Netlify. It would work. Another option, the one we went for, sounds a bit more fancy, but ended up being achievable without a single line of code. And it's a bit more integrated into our day-to-day tooling of our company. It's Slack. Where Netlify has inbound webhooks to trigger a build, Slack has outgoing webhooks for sending those sorts of commands. And we're going to marry the two together. Within Slack's online settings area, you can create a new webhook, set the channel it works against, the URL that it posts to, that one from Netlify, and then the trigger words that call it. And for us, that was launch SofaConf. The content team were so excited to run this magic command in Slack and see their changes go live. They're not traditionally in charge of deployments, so letting them behind the magician's curtain and triggering build processes was actually really cool and a great way to unite the team a bit more. And with very little effort on our own part, other than just building sensibly and choosing responsible technologies, we had a maxed out Lighthouse score. As I said earlier, global performance is available for everyone with Jamstack. This is the fastest conference site we've ever built, so our users will be happy. The CMS was totally tailored to the events and will be a consistent platform going forwards, so they were happy, the events team. It was built in record time and it's going to speed up future builds, so all of our stakeholders were really happy. And finally, it was built with modern web tools, and so the front-end team, I was happy. We maxed out our internal scores as well. We got the site live in a number of days, we sold out of early bird tickets within 2 hours, and it was a huge team success with genuine collaboration brought together with a Jamstack approach. I hope you found that a useful story with some handy tips in there for how you can gather requirements more effectively, choose appropriate technology, and bring your organisation along for this exciting Jamstack ride. Thank you so much for listening. I've got a few minutes now for any questions if you'd like to type them in the chat window, and if not, just have a great time at the rest of your conference. Thanks so much.